No one will become a Christian ever if they had to wait until all of their questions were answered, all of their doubts dispelled.
What if I still have doubts? Can I still follow Jesus without being 100% sure?
Doubts is a great question. In fact, you wouldn't be a very sincere, honest follower of Jesus if you didn't ever have doubts. Jesus came down from a mountain, and a father was in need of his son, who was demon possessed, needing healing. And Jesus says to the father, do you believe? And the father goes, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. So there is the natural doubt that comes because we don't have all the information, because at the end of it, we're still fearful. But I think from that interaction of that father and Jesus, you see, he wants to believe, even though he still has doubts. And that's perfectly acceptable because God meets us where we are. No one comes to God with perfect faith. So doubts are not just real, they're actually healthy to bring to God and say, look, I don't have it all there. I want to believe. Help me overcome my disbelief. But our stance towards, so there's two kinds of doubts. There's the doubt of the skeptic who says, no matter what you say, I'm not going to believe you. And there were people who approached Jesus like that, and Jesus didn't give them the time of the day because their stance was already, in some sense, hostile. But then there's the doubt of the genuine seeker, like the father who says to Jesus, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. And Jesus has all the time in the world to meet those people where they are. And any relationship, whether it's friendship, whether it's marriage, you're never going to get into a relationship, a friendship or marriage with all the information, with all full faith. Like, I didn't propose to my wife, Karen, because I had zero doubts or had all the information. I proposed to her because I knew enough, and I knew that I could trust her based on what I did know. And I still had to take a step of faith, right? And then we spent the last 25 years working that out. And I'm so glad we're still married, and I'm so glad I took that step of faith. And relationship with God is like that. No one will become a Christian ever if they had to wait until all of their questions were answered, all of their doubts dispelled. And the other thing is, doubts also come in the context of life experience. So someone who's young and relatively naive may not have as many doubts, but then life hits them hard, like they lose a loved one, or they get cancer, or they lose their job. And then these natural doubts come. It doesn't mean you've lost your faith, but they just come with being beaten up by life. And Jesus, being full of compassion and kindness as he walks with us, meets us where we are. And there are times in every Christian's life where it's like, God, I'm just hanging on by a thread. I do trust you, but I have all of these questions. But I'm going to trust you with these questions, right? To actually sit in that space is a healthy, normal, and a good thing, especially because life does throw us a lot of curveballs. But Jesus meets us there in our doubts. And so that's the thing, when we have doubts, not to be embarrassed about them, not to be ashamed of them. Certainly take them to God, and in community, take them to people who might have the answers to some of our questions. But even if not all the questions are answered, that's okay, because again, Jesus meets us where we are. Because as long as our stance towards him, in a sense, we're turning towards him in our doubt rather than using the doubts as an excuse to turn away in skepticism. And I think that makes all the difference. So, for example, I don't really doubt the resurrection of Jesus like I did when I was 15 years old. Okay, I don't doubt that that's a historical fact. That's been settled. But there have been times since I was 15 that I've doubted the goodness of God in a way that I didn't when I was 15. Why? Because, again, life has hit me as a 48-year-old in the last 33 years in a way that I couldn't have imagined when I was 15. And so new questions arise in my faith, new doubts. They're not just things that hit us when we're just that seeking new believer. You'll have some of those things settled, but then there'll be new things that come up. And so the life of faith is constantly coming back to God and saying, okay, your word says this, you promised this, but my experience is here. And I'm finding that hard to reconcile. Yeah, Lord help me in the context of relationship with others and community, but ultimately it's inner struggle. Lord help me work out how to overcome those, and I will choose to keep trusting you in spite of that. And the reason why we'll always have doubts is because we're not in heaven yet. That's a simple answer. The Bible says, right now we live by faith, not by sight. Okay, there is a day when we will live by sight, when all the doubts will disappear, when we see God face to face. Right now, we live on the basis of promises and commitment, God's commitment to us and his promises. And when you're living on promises and you're not in heaven yet, and especially we live in a world that is so broken, that calls into question, especially the two things that always call into question is the goodness of God and the sovereignty or the control of God. Right? And if these two things don't keep rearing their head in different ways, and we haven't really lived, or we really don't have faith. Because faith will constantly say, well, these are your promises, and yet this is what I'm seeing around me, and this is what I'm experiencing. How do I overcome that gap? That gap will be overcome when we go to heaven, or when heaven comes to earth in the new creation. But until then, there'll always be that wrestle. That's normal, and that's healthy, because it's in the context of wrestling and trusting and choosing to trust and surrendering that and saying, Lord, help me overcome my unbelief. That's when we grow.